He threw a glass ashtray at the wall. It shattered, spraying cheap glass over the scuffed linoleum. The bodyguards, the bartender, the terrified manager, everyone flinched. Everyone except Nora. She just looked at the mess, sighed, and picked up a damp rag. She wasn't brave. She was just working a 14-hour double shift, and frankly didn't have the energy to care that Damien Falcone's temper tantrums usually ended in a bloodbath. She only cared that someone had to sweep it up. The diner smelled like stale fryer, grease-burnt coffee, and the sharp chemical tang of industrial bleach. It was 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a manic, flickering energy that drilled straight into the base of Nora's skull. Her feet ached. Not a dull throb, but a sharp, biting pain radiating from her arches, right through the cheap soles of her non-slip shoes. The bell above the glass door jangled violently. The cold night air shoved its way inside, bringing with it the smell of wet asphalt and ozone. Damien Falcone walked in. He didn't glide in like some cinematic mobster. He moved like a live wire snapping across a wet puddle, twitchy, erratic, radiating a jagged kind of violence. Two men flanked him, built like brick walls in cheap suits, their eyes scanning the empty booths. Behind the counter, Vince, the night manager, made a small, pathetic squeaking noise and retreated into the kitchen. Nora didn't retreat. She poured another cup of decaf for the drunk guy passed out in booth 3, then grabbed her order pad. Damien slid into booth 4. The red vinyl squeaked in protest. He looked terrible. There were dark, bruised bags under his eyes, and his jaw was clenched so tight the muscle twitched visibly beneath his skin. He was wearing a tailored suit, but the tie was ripped off, the collar unbuttoned, and a dark reddish-brown stain speckled the left cuff of his white shirt. Blood. Old blood. He was muttering something to the larger of his two gorillas. The bodyguard nodded, looking terrified. Nora walked over. She didn't smile. She hadn't smiled since her rent went up 3 months ago. Coffee. Damien snapped, not looking at her. He was picking at a splinter on the edge of the Formica table. Regular or decaf? Nora asked. Her voice was flat, a sandpaper rasp. Damien's head snapped up. His eyes were dark, the pupils blown wide. Do I look like a guy who drinks decaf? You look like a guy who needs to sleep for a week, Nora said. It slipped out. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't a calculated move to show him she was tough. It was pure, unfiltered exhaustion. Her brain-to-mouth filter had dissolved somewhere around hour 11 of her shift. The silence in the diner instantly thickened. The bodyguard shifted his weight, his hand dropping casually toward his hip. Damien stared at her. The twitch in his jaw stopped. "Get me regular," he said quietly. Nora turned on her heel, her hip bumping the edge of the counter. She grabbed the glass pot with the orange handle, poured a mug, and walked back. She set it down in front of him. Damien looked at the black liquid. Then, without breaking eye contact with her, he casually raised his hand and backhanded the mug. It flew off the table, shattering against the linoleum. Hot black coffee splattered across the floor, splashing onto the hem of Nora's jeans. "It's cold," Damien said. The bodyguard smirked. Vince peered out from the circular window of the kitchen door, his face pale. Nora looked down at the mess, the brown puddle creeping toward her worn sneakers, the ceramic shards. She felt a slow, heavy wave of anger roll through her chest, drowning out the fear that should have been there. She had mopped that floor 20 minutes ago. Her lower back was screaming. She looked back up at him. She didn't glare. She just looked incredibly tired. She reached into her apron, pulled out a thick wad of rough brown paper napkins, and dropped them directly onto the center of the table in front of him. "Clean it up," she said. The bodyguard actually choked on his own breath. "You dumb bitch, do you know who—" "Shut up, Leo!" Damien interrupted. His voice was soft, dangerously soft. He was looking at Nora like she was a new species of insect he had just discovered. Nora wiped her wet hands on her apron. "I'm not picking that up. I mopped at 3. You threw it, you clean it. Or you can leave. I don't care. But I'm not doing it." She turned around and walked back behind the counter, fully expecting a bullet in the back of her head. Her hands were shaking. She shoved them deep into her pockets so they wouldn't see. She grabbed a rag and started viciously wiping down the stainless steel counter, focusing on the rhythmic squeak of the cloth. A minute passed. Only the hum of the fridge, then the sound of a chair scraping back, heavy footsteps. Nora didn't look up until she heard the rustle of paper. Damien was on one knee. He was grabbing the brown napkins, swiping at the puddle of coffee. He was doing a terrible job just smearing the liquid around the linoleum, picking up the larger shards of ceramic. He stood up, dumped the soggy brown mess onto his table, threw a crumpled $100 bill next to it, and walked out into the rain without a backward glance. He came back the next night. It was raining harder this time, heavy drops slapping against the large front window, blurring the neon glow of the streetlights outside. The diner was dead. Nora was leaning against the pie case, counting the sugar packets. The bell jangled. Damien walked in alone. He shook the water from his dark hair like a stray dog, his leather jacket squeaking as he moved. He didn't go to a booth. He sat directly at the counter, right in front of where Nora was standing. She didn't acknowledge him immediately. She finished counting the pink packets, wrote a number on a clipboard, and then looked at him. "Coffee?" she asked. "Yeah. And don't spill it." She poured the mug, set it down gently, and went back to her clipboard. Damien pulled a lighter from his pocket. It was heavy-brushed gold, probably worth more than her car. He flipped it open. Clack. He sparked it. A perfect, bright flame. He closed it. Click. Clack. Spark. Click. Clack. Spark. Click. The sound was metallic, sharp and rhythmic. It cut through the quiet hum of the diner like a knife scraping against bone. Nora tried to ignore it. She moved down the counter to fill the salt shakers. Clack. Spark. Click. He was staring at her. She could feel his eyes tracking her movements. It wasn't a sexual stare. It was predatory, calculating. He was waiting for her to snap. She poured the salt. Clack, spark, click. Nora slammed the metal salt shaker down on the counter. She walked over to him, reached out and snatched the gold lighter right out of his hand. Damien froze. His hand was still in the air, fingers curled around empty space. The silence that followed was suffocating. "Stop it," Nora said, her voice a low grate. She tossed the lighter onto the counter, a few inches from his coffee mug. "My head is pounding, and that noise is making me want to swallow glass." Damien looked at the lighter, then slowly raised his eyes to hers. "Do you have a death wish, sweetheart? I have rent due on the first and a car that needs a new alternator," she replied, picking up a damp rag. "Dying would be a logistical nightmare right now. Drink your coffee." She turned her back on him to wipe down the milkshake machine. He didn't say anything for a long time. When she finally turned back around, the mug was empty, the $100 bill was sitting next to it, and Damien was gone. The gold lighter was still sitting on the counter. Nora stared at it. It was heavy warm from his hand. She should throw it in the lost and found box. She should toss it in the trash. Instead, she thought of her own cheap, neon-green plastic lighter that had died 3 days ago, leaving her struggling to light her stove at home. She slipped the gold lighter into the pocket of her apron. Its weight felt cold against her thigh. 2 hours later, Nora was wrestling a black trash bag out the back door into the alley. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with humidity and the smell of rotting cabbage and wet brick. She heaved the bag into the green dumpster, the metal lid clanging loudly in the quiet alley. Stealing from me is a bad idea. Nora jumped her foot, slipping on a patch of grease. She caught herself on the edge of the dumpster. Damien was leaning against the brick wall in the shadows. The tip of a cigarette glowed a dull, angry orange in the dark. Nora caught her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wiped her hands on her jeans. "You left it." "I forgot it." "Then you should keep better track of your expensive toys," she said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out the heavy gold lighter and held it out toward him. He didn't move to take it. He took a drag of his cigarette, the cherry illuminating the sharp angles of his face. "Keep it. You seem to like it." Nora's arm dropped. "I don't want it." "Take it back." Damien pushed off the wall and took a slow step toward her. The alley was too narrow. He was too big, too suffocatingly close. She could smell him now, expensive woody cologne, stale tobacco, and the underlying scent of nervous sweat. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" he asked. His voice was genuinely perplexed. It wasn't an arrogant question. It was almost vulnerable. Nora let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I am afraid of you. I just don't have the energy to coddle your ego about it. You want people to cower. Go find someone who isn't working a double shift to afford groceries." She shoved the lighter roughly into his chest. He reflexively brought his hand up to catch it, his fingers brushing against hers. His skin was unnervingly hot. Nora turned and walked back toward the diner door. "Nora," he called out. She stopped her hand on the metal handle but didn't look back. She hadn't told him her name. He had read her name tag, or he had looked into her. The thought sent a cold shiver down her spine. "Make sure the coffee is hot tomorrow," he said. She pulled the door open and stepped inside, locking the deadbolt with a loud, definitive snap. A week passed. The rhythm settled. Damien came in every night at 3 a.m., sat at the counter, drank black coffee, and didn't throw anything. They barely spoke. It was an armed truce built on caffeine and mutual insomnia. Until Thursday. The bell didn't jangle so much as it crashed. The door banged violently against the wall. Nora spun around from the grill. Damien stumbled inside. He looked like a train wreck. His expensive leather jacket was torn at the shoulder. His face was smeared with dirt and blood. A deep, jagged cut above his left eyebrow was bleeding freely, the blood running down the side of his face, soaking into the collar of his shirt. His knuckles were raw, split open, and dripping crimson onto the floor. He didn't swagger. He swayed. He leaned heavily against the edge of booth one, his breathing ragged and wet. Vince predictably vanished. Nora stood frozen for a split second. Every instinct screamed at her to run into the back, lock the office door, and call the cops. The violence he carried had finally spilled over, ruining the fragile bubble of their diner routine. Damien looked up at her through his one good eye. He didn't look terrifying right now. He looked pathetic. He looked like a cornered animal that had barely survived a fight. "First aid kit," he rasped, his voice thick. "Now." Nora swallowed hard. She turned off the grill, wiped her hands, and walked to the back near the employee lockers. She pulled down the rusted metal box with the faded red cross. It smelled like old bandages and iodine. She brought it out to the counter. Damien had managed to drag himself onto a stool. He was clutching his ribs, his head bowed. Nora popped the latches on the box. "You need a hospital. That cut needs stitches." "No hospitals," he grunted, wincing as he shifted his weight. "Just clean it." Nora pulled out a bottle of cheap antiseptic, a stack of gauze, and some medical tape. She walked around the counter and stood in front of him. "Tilt your head back," she ordered. He glared at her, his jaw tight. "Don't give me orders." Nora didn't blink. "If you bleed on this floor, I have to mop it again. Tilt. Your..." Head. For a long second he stared at her, the hostility rolling off him in waves. Then slowly, with a pained hiss, he tilted his head back. Nora poured the brown antiseptic onto a piece of gauze. "This is going to burn." She didn't wait for him to brace himself. She pressed the soaked gauze firmly against the cut above his eyebrow. Damien let out a sharp, choked gasp, his whole body going rigid. His hand shot out and clamped around her wrist like a vice. Nora gasped, dropping the bottle of antiseptic. It clattered onto the counter. His grip was agonizing bruising. He was glaring at her, his eyes wild feral. "You're doing that on purpose!" He snarled, his breath hot against her face. Nora's heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was terrified. This was the monster everyone whispered about. This was the man who snapped fingers and broke bones. But as she looked down at his hand, gripping her wrist, she noticed something. He was shaking. A fine, uncontrollable tremor ran through his arm. Beneath the blood and dirt, his skin was pale, clammy with shock. He wasn't gripping her just to hurt her. He was holding on because the pain was grounding him. The fear in Nora's chest fractured, replaced by a bizarre, heavy knot of pity. "Let go of my wrist," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. Damien stared at her, his chest heaving. The wild look in his eyes flickered, breaking apart. Slowly his fingers loosened. He dropped his hand to his lap, his knuckles leaving smears of red on his dark jeans. Nora picked up a fresh piece of gauze. She didn't say another word. She moved closer, stepping into his space. She gently wiped the blood away from his eye, cleaning the jagged edge of the wound. She could feel the heat radiating off him. Up close, the smell of copper and sweat was overwhelming. She taped a large bandage over his eyebrow, her fingers brushing lightly against his temple. "Give me your hands," she muttered. He hesitated, then slowly lifted his hands. His knuckles were shredded, embedded with dirt. Nora took his left hand in hers. The contrast was stark. His hand was large, heavily calloused, coated in violence. Hers was smaller skin, pruned from dishwater rough, from cleaning chemicals. She began to wipe the dirt from his cuts. He winced, his fingers twitching in her grasp, but he didn't pull away. "You should be running," Damien said quietly, looking down at their hands. "You should be screaming for the cops." "I told you," Nora said, wrapping a strip of white tape around his knuckles. "I hate paperwork." Damien looked up at her face. They were inches apart. The diner was completely silent except for the steady drumming of the rain outside and the harsh buzz of the fluorescent lights. "Why do you put up with me?" he asked. The arrogant edge was entirely gone. Nora finished taping his hand. She didn't let go immediately. She looked down at the white bandages, stained slightly pink where the blood was already seeping through. "Because," she said softly, finally releasing his hand, "I think if someone didn't pour you coffee, you'd probably burn the whole city down just to stay warm." She picked up the bloody gauze and threw it in the trash. When she turned back, Damien was looking at her with an intensity that made the breath catch in her throat. For the first time, he didn't look like a mob boss. He just looked like a man who was profoundly, terrifyingly lonely. At 6 a.m., the diner doors finally locked. The sky over the city was the color of a day-old bruise, a sickly, yellowish purple that promised more rain and no warmth. Nora pushed through the heavy glass door, the hinges groaning in protest. Every joint in her body felt filled with wet sand. Her apron was rolled into a tight, sour-smelling ball at the bottom of her tote bag, reeking of fryer grease and the cheap cherry soap from the employee bathroom. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders, bracing for the 4-block walk to the bus stop. The street was dead slick with black puddles reflecting the dying neon of the diner's sign. A heavy, low purr vibrated through the soles of her shoes. A black SUV, sleek and armored, was idling right at the curb. It looked like a shark dropped into a dirty bathtub. The tinted passenger window slid down with a quiet, expensive hum. Damien was in the driver's seat. He had traded the ruined shirt for a dark, fitted sweater that made his shoulders look impossibly wide in the dim cab. The white bandage over his eye starkly contrasted with his olive skin. "Get in," he said. Nora stopped. She looked at the car, then at him, then down the empty, garbage-strewn street. "My bus comes in 7 minutes. I'm not asking Nora. Get in the car." It wasn't a threat, but it was an order. The kind of order given by a man who had never been told no in his adult life. She let out a breath that clouded in the damp air. She didn't have the energy to argue. Her feet were screaming, and the thought of standing on a rusted metal bench for a bus that was always late suddenly felt like a mountain she couldn't climb. She walked around the hood and pulled the heavy door open. It took actual effort. She climbed in. The contrast hit her like a physical blow. The interior of the SUV was silent, a thick, soundproofed bubble that immediately cut off the ambient noise of the city. It smelled like expensive calfskin leather, faint peppermint, and something distinctly metallic like gun oil. The seat was soft, contoured, and heated. It felt like sinking into a cloud. She instantly felt hyper-aware of how much she must stink of stale coffee and onions. "Where?" Damien asked, putting the car in gear. "South side, corner of 4th and Elm," she muttered, staring straight ahead out the windshield. Damien didn't react, though everyone in the city knew South Side was a decaying husk of a neighborhood, abandoned by the city council and left to rot. He steered the heavy vehicle away from the curb. The drive was suffocatingly quiet. Nora kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, afraid to touch anything, afraid to leave a grease smudge on the pristine interior. She stole a glance at him. In the harsh, intermittent glare of the streetlights, his profile looked carved from stone. The bandage caught the light. He looked exhausted, tightly wound, gripping the leather steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. "You shouldn't be driving," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice sounded too loud in the insulated cabin. "You were in shock 3 hours ago." "I'm fine." "You were shaking." His jaw locked. A muscle jumped beneath his ear. "I handle my own problems. I always drive." "Right. Tough guy." Nora leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the dilapidated buildings blur past. "Must be exhausting having to perform all the time." Damien hit the brakes a little too hard at a red light. He turned his head to look at her. "Perform the act," Nora said tiredly, not looking at him. "The glowering, the intimidation, throwing things so people know how dangerous you are. You must burn through a lot of calories just trying to keep everyone terrified of you. It's not an act." His voice was low, laced with a genuine dark warning. "Maybe not anymore," Nora conceded softly. "Maybe it stuck." The light turned green. Damien hit the gas, the powerful engine roaring as it surged forward. They didn't speak again until he pulled up to the crumbling brick facade of her apartment building. The streetlights here were blown out. The only illumination came from the yellow, flickering bulb over the front door. The concrete steps were cracked weeds, pushing violently through the concrete. Damien put the car in park. He looked at the building, his nose wrinkled slightly, a micro-expression of absolute disgust. "This is it?" he asked. Nora felt a sudden hot flash of defensive anger. "It has a roof, most of the time." She reached for the door handle. "Wait," Damien said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick stack of bills held together by a silver money clip. It had to be $3, maybe $4,000. He held it out to her. "Move." Nora stared at the money. It was crisp clean. It was more than she made in 4 months of double shifts. It was a new alternator, a full fridge and heat that actually worked. Her stomach twisted with something ugly and heavy. She looked up from the money meeting his dark eyes. "I didn't patch you up for a tip, Damien." "It's not a tip. It's common sense. You live in a slum." "It's my slum," Nora said, her voice dropping to a flat, hard register. She didn't touch the money. "I earn what I have. I don't need charity, and I definitely don't need blood money from a guy who throws coffee cups at my floor." Damien's eyes narrowed. The hand holding the money hovered between them. "Pride is a stupid thing to die for, Nora. So is whatever you're doing," she shot back. She pulled the heavy door handle. The cold, wet air of Southside rushed back in, breaking the spell of the expensive car. She stepped out, slamming the armored door behind her. She didn't look back as she walked up the cracked steps, unlocked the deadbolt, and disappeared into the dark, damp hallway of her building. Outside, Damien sat with the engine idling for 20 minutes before finally pulling away. 3 days later, the diner smelled like burning sugar. Someone had left a cherry pie in the heating case too long, and the sticky syrup was blackening against the metal coils. Nora was scrubbing the pie tin in the back sink, the hot water turning her hands an angry, raw red. The bell above the door jingled. It wasn't the violent crash of Damien's arrival. It was polite, measured. Nora dried her hands on a towel and pushed through the swinging kitchen door. The diner was mostly empty, save for a trucker asleep in a back booth. Sitting at the counter right in Damien's usual spot was a man Nora had never seen before. He didn't look like Damien's usual muscle. He wasn't wearing a cheap suit. He was wearing a tailored charcoal grey overcoat. His hair was silver, meticulously combed back. He looked like an investment banker, save for the fact that his eyes were dead. They were pale blue, flat, and completely devoid of warmth. He was resting his hands on the counter. He wore black leather gloves. Nora felt a sudden icy prickle at the base of her neck. The hairs on her arms stood up. Her instincts, honed by years of living in a rough city, were screaming at her. She walked slowly behind the counter, keeping the heavy milkshake machine between them. "What can I get you?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but her throat felt dry. The man smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Just a glass of ice water, my dear." Nora turned to the fountain, filled a glass, and set it down. She didn't put a coaster underneath it. The man looked at the glass, watching the condensation bead on the sides. "You work hard. Late hours. Not a very safe neighborhood." "I manage," Nora said, picking up her order pad, pretending to review it. "I'm a friend of Damien's," the man said smoothly. Nora stopped. She didn't look up. "He doesn't have friends. He has employees and enemies." "Which one are you?" The man chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Very perceptive. My name is Holden. I suppose you could call me a business associate of his father." Holden reached inside his overcoat. Nora's breath hitched her hand, dropping instinctively toward the heavy metal ice scoop beneath the counter. But Holden only pulled out a silver cigar tube. He didn't light it. He just rolled it slowly between his gloved fingers. "Damien is a chaotic boy." Holden continued, his voice barely above a whisper, carrying effortlessly in the quiet diner. "He lacks discipline. He lets his temper dictate his actions. And lately he has been spending an unusual amount of time sitting exactly where I am sitting right now." "He drinks coffee," Nora said tightly. "That's not a crime." "No," Holden agreed. "But it is a weakness. Damien's father does not tolerate weakness, nor do his rivals. When a man like Damien suddenly deviates from his routine, people notice. They look for the reason." Holden finally looked directly at Nora. His pale blue eyes pinned her to the spot. "You are an anomaly, Nora. A loose thread. And in our world, loose threads get cut. Quickly, Nora's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The scent of Holden's cologne, something sickeningly floral, like lilies at a funeral, overpowered the smell of the burning cherry pie. Fear, sharp and metallic, flooded her mouth. This wasn't Damien's chaotic, explosive anger. This was cold, calculated violence. "I pour coffee." Nora forced out her knuckles, turning white as she gripped the edge of the counter. "That's it. I don't know anything about his business, and I don't care. If you have a problem with him, take it up with him." "Oh, we will," Holden said, standing up. He buttoned his overcoat with slow, deliberate movements. But Damien is notoriously difficult to teach. Sometimes you have to break a child's favorite toy to make him understand a lesson. Holden reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp, brand-new $100 bill. He folded it neatly into a triangle, creasing the edges perfectly with his gloved thumb. He placed it on the counter. "Buy yourself a bus ticket, Nora. Far away. Consider this a severance package." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked out, the bell jingling politely behind him. Nora stood frozen for a full minute. The diner felt suffocating. She looked down at the folded $100 bill. It looked exactly like the ones Damien threw on the floor. Her hands began to shake. Not a subtle tremor, but a violent, uncontrollable rattling. She reached out to clear the water glass Holden had left untouched. Her fingers slipped. The heavy glass hit the linoleum floor and shattered into 100 jagged pieces. She stared down at the mess, the water seeping into the cracks of the floorboards. She dropped to her knees, hiding her face in her rough, chemical-burned hands, and for the first time in years, she let out a broken, terrified sob. Damien didn't come in at 3 a.m. He came at midnight. The diner was actually busy, 4 booths full of late-night college students, the grill hissing with burgers and onions. Nora was balancing 3 plates on her arm, her mind completely detached from her body. Every time the door opened, she expected to see Holden's pale eyes. Every shadow looked like a man in a grey overcoat. The door banged open. Damien stalked in. He wasn't wearing a jacket, just a black button-down shirt rolled up to the elbows. He didn't look tired. He looked utterly terrifyingly furious. He bypassed the counter entirely and marched straight toward Nora in the middle of the aisle. "Put those down," he ordered, his voice cutting through the chatter of the college kids. "I'm working," Nora snapped, turning away from him to slide a plate of fries onto Booth 3's table. Damien reached out, grabbed her upper arm, and spun her around. The sudden movement made the remaining 2 porcelain plates slide off her arm. They crashed to the floor with a deafening clatter, French fries and ketchup splattering across the tiles. The entire diner went dead silent. "Hey man, what the hell?" One of the college kids stood up. Damien didn't even look at him. He just slowly turned his head, fixing the kid with a stare so lethally dark that the boy instantly sat back down, pale and silent. Vince, the manager, poked his head out of the kitchen, saw Damien and ducked right back in. "You're done!" Damien hissed, looking back at Nora. He let go of her arm. "Get your coat." Nora looked down at the broken plates, the mess, the ruined food, the sheer arrogant entitlement of it all. The paralyzing terror Holden had left her with suddenly ignited into blind, white-hot rage. "You don't get to do this!" Nora yelled, her voice echoing off the cheap acoustic tiles. She pushed him. She actually put both hands on his solid chest and shoved him backward. He barely moved, but his eyes widened in shock. "You don't get to come in here and break things," she screamed, her lungs burning. "You don't get to grab me. I am not one of your people." "Holden was here," Damien said, stepping back into her space, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "Don't lie to me. My guys saw him leave. What did he say to you?" "He said you're a child who needs his toys broken." Nora spat tears of pure frustration prickling the corners of her eyes. He told me to run. And frankly, he made a really good point. Damien flinched. It was a minuscule movement, but Nora caught it. A shadow of genuine fear crossed his face, instantly buried beneath rage. "You're packing your shit right now," Damien ordered, grabbing her wrist again, dragging her toward the back kitchen doors. "You're coming with me to a safe house. You are not staying in this city." "Let go of me," Nora thrashed, digging her heels into the linoleum. She wrenched her arm out of his grasp as they burst through the swinging doors into the hot, greasy air of the kitchen. The kitchen was empty, the fryers bubbling aggressively. Nora backed up against the stainless steel prep table, her chest heaving. "I am not going anywhere with you. I am not entering your world. Do you understand? I am a waitress. I go home. I sleep. I pay my rent. That's my life. You brought this garbage to my door. I am trying to keep you breathing," Damien shouted, slamming his hand down on the metal table. The sound cracked like a gunshot. "Holden isn't a messenger, Nora. He's an executioner. If he came here, he's already planning how to kill you just to watch me bleed. You don't know these people." "And I shouldn't have to," she screamed back, matching his volume, stepping forward instead of retreating. "I was fine before you spilled coffee on my floor. I was exhausted, and I was broke, but I wasn't waiting for a bullet in the back of my head." They were inches apart now. The heat of the kitchen was stifling, smelling of old grease and raw meat. Damien was breathing heavily, looking down at her, his dark eyes frantic. "I know." He choked out the anger, suddenly draining out of him, leaving something much more dangerous behind. Desperation. "I know I brought this here. I ruin everything I touch, but I'm not letting them touch you." He reached out, but this time he didn't grab her wrist. He cupped her face. His hands were huge, rough with calluses and burning hot against her cold cheeks. Nora froze. She should have pushed him away. She should have run. But his touch wasn't violent. It was trembling. "Damien," she whispered, the fight suddenly leaking out of her. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her lips, his own parting slightly. The distance between them vanished. He didn't kiss her. He rested his forehead heavily against hers, his eyes closing tight. He let out a shaky breath that smelled like black coffee and rain. It was a surrender. The Mafia boss's son, the untouchable, chaotic terror of the city, was hiding from the world in the greasy kitchen of a late-night diner, clinging to a waitress who couldn't afford a new pair of shoes. "I'll buy the diner," he whispered against her skin. "I'll burn Holden's house to the ground. Just don't run. Please." Nora closed her eyes, feeling the terrifying magnetic pull of the disaster standing in front of her. She knew with absolute certainty that letting him stay would destroy her life. But as his thumb gently stroked her cheekbone, wiping away a streak of flour and grease, Nora realized she was already standing in the wreckage. They left the diner through the alley door. The rain had started again, a fine, freezing mist that clung to Nora's hair and eyelashes. She didn't look back at the glowing neon sign. She couldn't. If she looked back, she knew she would walk back inside, pick up the broom, and pretend none of this was happening. Damien's armored SUV was parked 2 blocks away, hidden in the shadow of a condemned parking garage. He didn't open the door for her. He was too busy scanning the street, his hand resting heavily inside his coat pocket. The shape of the gun was unmistakable. It made Nora's stomach physically cramp. The drive was a silent, suffocating blur. They didn't go to his world. They drove north past the glittering high-rises, past the decaying brick of Southside, deep into the industrial sprawl where the city bled out into rust and empty warehouses. He pulled into a neglected, single-story motel. The neon sign buzzed with a sound like a dying wasp. Several letters were burnt out. It read, M or in. Damien killed the engine. The sudden absence of the heavy rumble felt deafening. Get the bag from the back, he ordered, his voice clipped hollow. Nora climbed out. The air here smelled heavily of sulfur from a nearby refinery and wet asphalt. She opened the rear door and hauled out a heavy black canvas duffel bag. It clinked with a dense metallic weight. Weapons. Cash. She didn't want to know. Room 114. Damien unlocked the flimsy wooden door and pushed it open, stepping inside, first scanning the corners. Nora followed, dropping the bag onto the floor. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. The room was a sensory assault of cheapness. The carpet was a mottled, sickly brown, stiff with years of ground-in dirt and cheap cleaning chemicals. A single saggy queen mattress sat in the center of the room, covered by a thin floral bedspread that smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and ozone. The only light came from a single bulb in a plastic fixture above a scarred laminate dresser. Nora stood perfectly still by the door, her cheap tote bag clutched against her chest like body armor. Damien didn't look at her. He moved to the window, peering through the gap in the heavy light-blocking curtains. He checked the lock on the door. He checked the adjoining door. He moved like a machine, pure, kinetic energy running on adrenaline and paranoia. Finally, he stopped. He stood in the center of the room, looking at the faded wallpaper. The manic energy seemed to drain out of him all at once, leaving behind a shell of a man. His shoulders slumped. He ran a hand over his face, dragging his fingertips over the bandage on his eyebrow. "It's secure," he said to the wall. "No one knows about this place. It's not in the family ledgers." Nora slowly walked over to the edge of the bed and sat down. The springs groaned loudly, bowing under her slight weight. She looked at her hands. Her fingernails were chipped, the skin around them red and peeling from the industrial dish soap at the diner. "I lost my job," she said. Her voice was perfectly flat. Damien turned around. He looked at her, his brow furrowing, as if she were speaking a foreign language. "Holden is going to put a hit out on you, Nora. You're worried about pouring coffee. I'm worried about surviving." She snapped her head, jerking up. The anger was back, hot and sharp, cutting through the shock. "You think surviving is just dodging bullets? Surviving is paying rent. It's buying groceries. I don't have a safety net. Damien, I have $62 in my checking account. I don't have offshore accounts or duffel bags full of blood money." She kicked the heavy canvas bag on the floor with her worn sneaker. "You dragged me into a war I didn't ask for. You broke my plates. You ruined my job. And now I'm sitting in a motel room that smells like bleach and bad decisions, waiting to see if a man in a grey coat is going to murder me." She was hyperventilating the words, tumbling out of her in a frantic, panicked rush. Tears of pure frustration spilled over her lower lashes, hot and stinging. She hated herself for crying in front of him. Damien stared at her. The lethal, untouchable Mafia air looked completely, entirely out of his depth. He didn't know how to handle a woman who wasn't screaming in terror or throwing herself at him for his money. He didn't know how to fix a problem he couldn't punch or buy. Slowly he walked over to the bed. He didn't sit next to her. He sank to his knees on the filthy carpet right in front of her. Nora flinched backward. He didn't touch her. He just looked up at her. His dark eyes stripped of their usual arrogance, leaving only a raw, desperate exhaustion. "I know," he said. His voice was a rasping whisper. "I know I ruined it. I am poison, Nora. Everything I touch turns to ash. I warned you to stay away. I told you I was dangerous. You didn't warn me." She shot back, wiping her eyes roughly with the back of her hand. "You threw a coffee cup at me and expected me to act like a whipped dog." A bitter, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. And you told me to clean it up." He looked down at his own hands. The knuckles were still wrapped in the white tape she had applied hours ago, now stained dark brown with dried blood. "No one has ever told me to clean up my own mess," he said softly. "Not once in my entire life. They just sweep up the glass and hand me another cup." He raised his head, his gaze locking onto hers. The intensity in his eyes was suffocating. "I will fix this," Damien vowed, the gravel in his voice hardening into steel. "I will get you out of this city. I will get you a new name, a new life, 100 diners if you want them. But tonight you stay here. You lock the door and you don't open it for anyone." Nora's breath hitched. "Where are you going?" Damien stood up. The vulnerability vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating predator. He reached to the small of his back, adjusting the heavy steel tucked into his waistband. "I have to go see my father," he said. The name hung in the damp air of the motel room like a death sentence. Victor Falcone, the man who owned the judges, the police, and the ghosts. Damien. Nora stood up, her panic spiking for a completely different reason. She grabbed his forearm. "If Holden went behind your back, your father ordered it. He sent him." Damien looked down at her hand on his arm. "I know. Then if you go there, he'll kill you, or he'll lock you in a cage you can never leave." Damien stepped closer to her. He reached up his rough, bruised fingers, gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was so jarringly soft compared to the violence he was walking toward. "I don't care about the cage, Nora," he whispered, leaning down until his lips brushed against her forehead. The scent of him, leather rain and gunpowder, engulfed her. "I just care that you aren't in it." He pulled away, turned on his heel, and walked out the door. The lock clicked shut with a sharp, final sound. Nora was left standing alone in the center of the cheap motel room, listening to the roar of the SUV fading into the wet night, terrified by the realization that she was praying for the monster to come back. The estate of Victor Falcone wasn't a gaudy mansion. It was a fortress of grey stone and iron gates, sitting on a cliff overlooking the churning black water of the bay. The rain lashed against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of Victor's private study. But inside the room was dead silent. It smelled of old paper leather and expensive scotch. Damien stood in the center of the Persian rug. He was dripping wet, having refused an umbrella from the guards outside. Behind the massive mahogany desk sat his father. Victor Falcone was a small man, thin and fragile-looking, with snow-white hair and a face carved from pale marble. But his eyes were exactly like Damien's, dark, bottomless, and completely ruthless. Standing in the corner, blending into the shadows, was Holden. "You look terrible, Damien," Victor said, quietly, not looking up from the leather-bound ledger on his desk. His voice was a soft, cultured purr. "You are tracking mud into my home." "Call him off," Damien said. He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He stood perfectly still, his hands hanging loose at his sides. Victor slowly closed the ledger. He folded his hands on top of the desk and looked at his son. "Call who off?" "Holden. He went to the diner. He threatened her." Victor sighed a small, disappointed sound. "Holden was doing his job. You have become erratic, Damien. You spend your nights drinking cheap coffee, picking fights with street thugs, and mooning over a girl who smells like frying oil. You are my only heir. You are embarrassing me." "I don't care about your pride," Damien said, his jaw tightening. "I want her left alone. She is a distraction." Victor stated his tone chillingly casual. "Distractions in our business are fatal. The Russians are testing our borders. The port authorities are asking for larger bribes. And you are playing house with a peasant. It ends tonight. She gets on a bus or she goes in the ground. Damien's chest heaved. He looked at Holden, who was watching the exchange with the mild interest of a man watching dogs fight in a pit. "No," Damien said. The silence that followed was absolute. Victor's pale eyes narrowed. It was a microscopic shift, but in the Falcone family, it was the equivalent of a bomb detonating. "Excuse me," Victor whispered. "I said no," Damien repeated, taking a slow step toward the desk. "You don't touch her. Holden doesn't look at her. You let her walk away clean." Victor let out a dry, rattling laugh. "And what leverage do you imagine you have, my son? You are standing in my house, protected by my men, wearing clothes bought with my money. You have nothing that I do not allow you to have." Damien reached into his leather jacket. Instantly, Holden drew a suppressed pistol from his overcoat, aiming it squarely at the back of Damien's head. Damien didn't flinch. He didn't even look back. He slowly pulled out his hand. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a heavy gold signet ring. The Falcone crest. He had worn it on his right hand since his 18th birthday. He tossed it onto the mahogany desk. It landed with a heavy metallic clatter, rolling to a stop against the leather ledger. "I have my name," Damien said. "I'm giving it back." Victor stared at the ring. For the first time, a flicker of genuine shock cracked his marble facade. "You cannot be serious. You would forfeit your birthright, the empire, billions of dollars. For a waitress who doesn't even want you, she's the only real thing I've ever touched," Damien said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I'm done being your attack dog. I'm done bleeding for your ledgers. I sign the shares over to my cousin. I walk away with nothing. You let her live." Victor looked at his son for a long, terrible minute. The rain battered the glass. "If you walk out that door without that ring," Victor said, his voice turning to ice, "you are no longer my son. You will have no money, no protection. If a street gang decides to gut you for your shoes, my men will step over your corpse. You will be a nobody." "Draw up the papers," Damien said flatly. Victor stared at him, his face twisting with a sudden vicious disgust. He nodded once to Holden. "Have the lawyers draft the relinquishment, immediately." It took 2 hours. Damien sat in a hard wooden chair, reading through 70 pages of legal jargon that effectively erased him from the world of power. He signed his name 24 times. With every stroke of the pen, he felt a massive, suffocating weight lifting off his chest, replaced by a terrifying, dizzying freefall. When he signed the final page, he stood up. He left the pen on the desk. "It's done," Damien said. He turned to leave. "Damien!" Victor called out. Damien stopped his hand on the heavy brass doorknob. "You are leaving my family," Victor said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "But you broke my rules. There is always a tax for breaking the rules." Damien turned around. Holden had put the gun away. He was slowly pulling off his suit jacket, folding it neatly over a chair. 2 of the massive guards from the hallway stepped into the room, locking the door behind them. They were pulling on heavy weighted knuckle gloves. Damien didn't beg. He didn't reach for his own gun. He knew if he pulled it, he would die, and Nora would be left unprotected. He just took off his leather jacket, dropping it to the floor. He rolled up his sleeves, exposing his bruised, battered forearms. "Don't hit the face," Damien said to the guards, his voice devoid of fear. "She worries." Holden smiled a thin, cruel line. The first guard swung a bat. It caught Damien in the ribs with a sickening crack. He went down hard, the air driven from his lungs in a violent rush. Before he could hit the floor, the second guard's boot caught him in the stomach. Damien curled into a tight ball, protecting his head and neck. He didn't fight back. He took the beating. He let them shatter his ribs, bruise his kidneys, and split his skin. Every blow, every flare of white-hot agony was a down payment on his freedom. He closed his eyes, tasting copper and bile, and focused entirely on the smell of burnt coffee and cheap cherry soap. 20 minutes later, the door to the study opened. Damien was dragged out by his collar, leaving a smear of blood on the Persian rug. They dumped him on the wet gravel of the driveway, the freezing rain immediately soaking into his clothes. Holden stood over him, looking down with dead eyes. He tossed Damien's keys onto the ground next to his face. "The severance is paid," Holden said softly. "If I ever see your face in this city again, I won't use my fists." Holden turned and walked back inside the heavy oak doors, slamming shut, locking Damien out in the cold. Damien lay on the wet stones for a long time, the rain washing the blood from his face. Every breath was a jagged knife in his chest. He dragged himself to his knees, his vision swimming his body, screaming in protest. He found his keys. He crawled to his car. He didn't have an empire anymore. He didn't have a name. But as he put the truck in gear and drove away from the fortress, heading back toward the cheap, glowing neon of the motel, Damien Falcone smiled through his broken teeth. He was free. 6 months later. The apartment smelled like wet paint, cheap vanilla candles and simmering garlic. It was a third-floor walk-up in a working-class neighborhood in Chicago. The floorboards creaked terribly, the radiator clanked like a dying engine, and the view out the window was just a brick alleyway. It was the best place Nora had ever lived. She stood at the tiny stove, stirring a pot of pasta sauce. She was wearing sweatpants and one of Damien's oversized t-shirts. Her hair was tied up in a messy bun. She looked tired. She had just finished an 8-hour shift at a local bakery, but the deep, haunted bags under her eyes were gone. The frantic edge to her movements had smoothed out. The front door unlocked with a heavy clunk. Damien walked in. He was wearing heavy canvas work pants, scuffed steel-toe boots, and a grey thermal shirt stained with sawdust and drywall mud. He looked completely different. The expensive haircuts were gone, replaced by a slightly shaggy, overgrown mess. The tailored suits were traded for calluses and dirt. He worked construction, framing houses. It turned out that the stamina required to survive Mafia beatings translated surprisingly well to hauling lumber up 3 flights of stairs. He shut the door, locked the deadbolt, and leaned heavily against the wood, letting out a long, exhausted breath. "You smell like a hardware store," Nora said, not looking up from the stove, a small smile playing on her lips. Damien pushed off the door and walked into the tiny kitchen. He came up behind her, wrapping his thick, heavily scarred arms around her waist, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He breathed her in his chest, rising and falling against her back. "And you smell like garlic and sugar," he mumbled into her skin. Nora leaned back against him, closing her eyes. The solid heat of his body was her anchor. The transition hadn't been easy. The first 2 months had been a nightmare of paranoia. Damien had barely slept, pacing the small apartment, jumping at every car backfire, checking the locks 10 times a night. He had violently panicked the first time she went to the grocery store alone. He had to unlearn a lifetime of hunting and being hunted. Nora had to teach him how to be a person, how to open a checking account, how to use a coin-operated laundromat. She had watched a former Mafia prince stare at a washing machine with genuine frustrated bewilderment. "How was work?" she asked, turning the heat down on the sauce. Framer mismeasured the load-bearing wall. Damien grunted, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. "We had to tear down 3 hours of work. The foreman was screaming." "Did you scream back?" Damien paused. He lifted his head, a wry smirk on his face. "I wanted to. I thought about breaking his clipboard over his knee. But I just nodded and pulled the nails." Nora turned around in his arms. She reached up her thumbs, gently tracing the faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the only remaining physical proof of the diner, the night everything changed. "I'm proud of you." she said softly. Damien looked down at her. The darkness that used to drown his eyes was gone, replaced by something steady, grounded, and fiercely protective. He didn't have billions of dollars anymore. He had a battered pickup truck, a sore back, and her. And he guarded this mundane, beautiful life with the same lethal intensity he used to guard his father's empire. "Sit down," Nora said, tapping his chest. "You look like you're going to fall over. I'll get you a coffee." Damien let her go with a reluctant groan and dropped onto one of the cheap wooden chairs at the small dining table. He rubbed his face, rolling his shoulders to pop the stiff joints. Nora went to the counter. She grabbed a chipped blue ceramic mug. She poured the coffee from the glass pot. As she turned to walk back to the table, her wet slipper caught the edge of the frayed linoleum. Nora stumbled. The blue mug slipped from her grasp. It hit the floor and shattered. Hot brown liquid exploded across the cheap tiles, splashing against the cabinets and pooling around the ceramic shards. Nora froze. Her breath caught in her throat. For a split second, the smell of the coffee and the sound of the shattering glass instantly transported her back to that fluorescent-lit diner at 3 a.m. The memory of terror spiked in her chest. She slowly raised her eyes to look at Damien. Damien was already looking at her. He didn't flinch. His jaw didn't clench. There was no flash of explosive anger. He just looked at the mess, then looked up at her and let out a soft, genuine laugh. "Don't move," he said. "You're barefoot." He pushed his chair back. He stood up, walked over to the paper towel roll on the counter, and tore off a thick wad. He knelt down on the floor, right in the middle of the puddle, and started wiping up the coffee, carefully picking up the sharp pieces of the broken blue mug. Nora stood there, watching the man who used to make a city tremble on his knees, scrubbing her kitchen floor so she wouldn't cut her feet. Her heart swelled with a love so heavy and profound it physically ached. It wasn't a fairy tale romance. It was built on blood fear and shattered porcelain. They were two broken, jagged people who had somehow managed to fit their sharp edges together to build a safe place. Damien stood up, dumping the soggy paper towels and broken ceramic into the trash can. He washed his hands at the sink, drying them on his jeans. He turned back to her, leaning against the counter. He reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out the heavy, brushed gold lighter. The fuel had run out months ago. It couldn't light a flame anymore. But he kept it. A reminder. He rolled the gold metal between his calloused, scarred fingers. Clack, click. The sound wasn't menacing anymore. It was just a quiet, rhythmic tick in a warm, safe room. "So," Damien said, a teasing glint in his eye as he looked at her. "Regular or decaf?" Nora smiled, stepping forward and wrapping her arms tightly around his neck. "Decaf," she whispered against his lips. "I think we've had enough adrenaline for one lifetime." Wow, what a journey. From the gritty, terrifying nights at the Neon Diner to finding a fragile, hard-earned peace in Chicago. Nora and Damien's story proves that sometimes the most broken people can build the strongest foundations. Did you expect Damien to give up his entire empire for a waitress? Let me know your favorite moment in the comments down below. If this raw, emotional mafia romance kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more deeply human, intense storytelling. See you next time.